The song talks about our soul being still, being at rest. And there are lots of different ways that we interpret that or think about that. There's a lot of different possible reasons why our soul, our spirit needs to be at rest. Different phases of our life at different times. I'd like to talk about that in a way that maybe you hadn't thought about, but I'm motivated as an older man and watching families and churches and communities deal with the conflict, the anxieties, and the fears and the struggles that rob us of rest in God and rob our souls of being at rest with God. And I thought about that in terms of how the human story began with the idea of good and evil, and how the conflicts between good and evil became human feelings and human. They affect relationships. They affect our relationship with God, and our views of good and evil affect our views of one another and our acceptance or our relationships with one another. So I just wanted to explain a little bit what motivates my talk with you today. And it's about thriving in a world where good and evil both exist, where good and evil are being used to label people or label issues or to label ideas and ideologies in such a way that often our inner peace and our sense of security, our hope, our joy is replaced by a cloud of threat and fear and anxiety, anger, retaliation, discord, hate, all those things that none of us thrive with, that don't do our communities any good and don't do our families any good. I'm motivated because the way we define good and evil and the things we attach those terms to in our world today actually divide families. And I just, again, over Christmas, hearing people talk about their personal experiences of not enjoying being together because you can't talk, you can't be real, because people's ideologies and their views are so antagonistic to one another. And I believe that partly comes from the fact that we label things not only right and wrong. We have troubles. There are things that are right and wrong, but that can be different than good and evil. And so sometimes when we think someone's wrong, we feel the need to strengthen our position by calling that evil, or when something is good. I hope you understand. I hope I can help you think or understand what I'm thinking and why this matters. The concept of good and evil begins in the biblical story with a tree. In the first setting, and God called it the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I've often wondered, we wonder what all that means in that story. We don't know all of what that means in that story. We don't know all the reasons God asked them, told them, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he said, in the day you eat of it, you will die. Well, the fact that they did eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil opened the floodgates. It opened the world. It opened their world to an entirely different dynamic and to the power of evil. The power of good was already in creation and in the garden, but whether this was whether this happened through the actual physical eating of the fruit is irrelevant. What it does tell us, the story tells us that the flood, the effect, the release of the power of evil into human reality began there. So the question today, one of the questions, is it possible to thrive in a world where both good and evil exist? Is it possible to thrive? And by thriving, I think this morning about the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians, in the book of Galatians. You've heard them: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. That's human thriving. When those are our experience, when those are our fuel, when those are our mindset, that's when we thrive. And none of us thrives perfectly in those. But the question is, can we thrive? Is it possible to thrive in these days when both good and evil are present realities? We have choices. We can learn from history, and we can learn from the different eras as to how they define good and evil, and how people interacted with themselves and with God based on their understandings of good and evil. And there are lots more eras in history, but I'm going to mention a few. The first one is when God called a people to himself, the nation of Israel. And through the Torah, he provided them with definitions for good and evil and how to interact with those ideas, and interact with each other and with the world in terms of what is good and evil. And we jump ahead to the time of Christ and the early church. And the definitions, Chris, do you have another one there? Jesus began a new phase, a new age of defining good and evil. And especially thinking this morning of how shocking, how revolutionary the Sermon on the Mount was in defining good and evil in the eyes of those who had the Torah and those who had the scriptures of the nation of Israel. Good and evil was redefined, or not, well, it wasn't transformed by Jesus, but it was fulfilled and expanded and given a new way of thinking about it. And that's where we want to focus today, is on how much that changed our understandings, or potentially understandings, of good and evil, and how we define things and how we relate to one another in terms of that. But history goes on, and that wasn't the only way that we have continued to define good and evil. And in the 4th century, Constantine, the Roman emperor, Romanized the idea of good and evil, that Romanized the church. And so in the Roman Empire, being merged with the ideas of the church, and it became one entity, basically. And so all of this, the versions of good and evil were changed once again. And then jump ahead to the Middle Ages, where things like the Crusades, where good and evil were defined in terms of whether you were Jewish or Muslim or some other definition, and good and evil were defined by that, and then people were motivated to destroy one another on the basis of good and evil. And we jump ahead from that to Nazi Germany is another prime example of where the Germanization of I don't know if you like that term, if you're German origin like I am, but the Nazi Germany and like it even involved the church in redefining. It was the Germanization of the church and of good and evil to a large extent. And now, I think we have the Americanization of good and evil and of theology. The American version of what is good and evil is literally affecting the entire world, has for some time. The theology and the definitions of good and evil affects us in Canada, it affects the whole world, because that is the language, and it is in ways that are similar to what happened in other periods of history where there's a merging of definitions nationally and of the church. So today, I don't intend to help you decide if evil is woke ideology or if evil is political conservatives. I don't intend to help you decide whether evil is guns or evil is gun control, because those are things that divide us. For one person, evil is, the nature of evil is illustrated through guns and the use of guns. For another person, the nature of evil is control. For some, Trump is evil. For some, Trudeau is evil. For others, they're the essence of good. For some, capitalism is evil. For some, socialism is evil. We go on and on. Islam, Russia, Ukraine, environmentalism. All these things make us, we've come to talk about these things not as right or wrong opinions, but as evil or good in their nature, because that adds power, that adds effect to conflict. And our point this morning is not to decide what to think about those issues. My point, I hope to say it often enough that you actually believe me when I say my point is our mindset. Our point is how we define good and evil and how we relate to one another in terms of that. And to think about in those things that good is not defined by what you think about guns and gun control. Good is not even, and evil is not even defined by what you think about abortion. Good and evil is not even defined by what we think about liberalism or conservatism or any of those things. We tend to think that good, that some of those things are evil, some of the people who do those things are evil, and good is the way I think about those issues. That's what's good, is the way I view those issues and the way I respond to them. But let's orient ourselves as best we can to the Christ mindset, and to the mindset that helps us walk through and live in a world where good and evil both exist. And our methodology, our method of doing that is really critical. So next slide, please. One of the prevailing ideas for centuries, for millennia, is the idea that if we eradicate evil, good will fill the void. You think about all the things that are happening even right now that are based on that idea, that if we eradicate evil, good will fill the void. And with that, the idea that if we eradicate evil people, good will fill the void. Now, please understand me. The alternative is not to just tolerate evil or tolerate people who do evil. That's not my point. There are times when evil must be addressed as evil, and where evil acting people must be dealt with. But the methodology, the method and mindset that I feel we must guard against is the general idea that if we eradicate evil, good will fill the void. Hasn't happened very often. It doesn't usually happen. It might. Why doesn't it happen? Because we are not fully good. And no one, even if I eradicate evil in my own mind and in my own heart, if I work at resisting evil in my own heart, good does not always rush in to fill that void, because I'm not totally good. I have some good intentions. There are good things about me because I'm created in God's image, and this is true for you. We are created in God's image, and so there's a potential for good, but good does not rush in where evil is eradicated. We have to remember that. Jesus, in his teachings and life, and the early church in teachings about good and evil, did not assume that first we eradicate evil, then we fill that void with, then we do good. It seems more obvious that Jesus and the disciples sought to overcome evil with good by doing good. And again, that does not mean we never address evil or that it's wrong. I'm not telling you that I think it's wrong to intervene and deal with evil or evil people. I'm talking about a mindset where we don't assume that that is our solution or our number one method. I want to read a few verses from, I'm going to mention some of these scriptures. I encourage you to read them. Good can overcome evil according to Jesus' teachings and according to the apostles' teachings. In Matthew 5, Jesus set things on he totally flipped the script there by saying, no, we don't conquer the world through power. We actually conquer the world through, the power of God. But humans don't conquer the world and one another through power and aggressiveness. But actually, he said, the meek will inherit the earth. And he said many things like that. The weak is who God chose to work through. The poor are those who get God's attention, not the rich and wealthy. They don't attract God's attention, Jesus said. The poor do. The oppressed do. And again in Romans 12, I want to read a few verses. Let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection, outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal, be fervent in spirit, serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by doing so you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's a summary statement of what he was just describing. All those different actions are ways of overcoming evil with good. And it doesn't require that evil is first eradicated before we can do good. All he's telling us is do good. Do good to people. That's what he's saying. The way of Christ shows us that good is what overcomes evil. Proactive, intentional, and focused good. We try to find our peace with each other in different ways. Well, I have different ways of maintaining a state of peace. For some people, staying in a state of no conflict or having less conflict is to ignore the news reporting and isolate ourselves as much as possible. That's a way of maintaining some peace, is to ignore the news and ignore the immigration issues and the political election year issues in our world, or the conflict between Israel and Palestine, or the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Ignore them. For others, the way to maintain peace is to saturate ourselves in news reporting and talk shows that interpret world events. And then for some of us, we join a social political tribe and adopt their viewpoints and language. And we prepare to defend ourselves against whatever threats we expect. We assume that God is on our side and will defeat those we consider our enemies. These are ways that we work at finding peace, and they're common ways among Christians. These are very common ways. But the results of that, next slide please, is, as I see it, the results of the Americanization of good and evil is a faith that is fear-based. I want to talk about faith, outlook, good, evil, preparation, ideals, and hope in two different and contrasting ways. So the one contrast is faith that is fear-based, an outlook on life and the future that is based on destruction and escape, and a definition of good as is what protects and preserves my desired way of life. That's what's good, is what protects and preserves the good life for me. Evil is what threatens my sense of prosperity, my freedoms, and my goals. Preparation is threat-based, survivalist. This is what inspires the hoarding of food and ammunition and weapons, because preparation is survivalist, is threat-based. Ideals are enemy-driven. Ideals are defined mostly by our enemies, not by what we actually want. Ideals are mostly defined by enemies and reactionary. And hope is in the empire, the nation, and the people in power who can protect my way of life. These are, you might think this is harsh, but these are the words and the messaging and the ideals and the mindset of so many Christians. On the other hand, what I think Christ calls us to, and what the opportunity we have as we're conformed to the image of Christ. Let's move on from that screen. The mindset of Christ, as we are conformed to the image of Christ, and as we resist the mainstream of Christian culture, not only the mainstream of our culture, but the mainstream of Christian culture, I call us to resist. Because we find in these scriptures that I mentioned, and a theme throughout is that faith is pursuing the entire story of God's purposes and intentions. Outlook is based on Christ's kingdom, where God's will is done on earth. That's the outlook. God's will be done on this earth. That's the plan. I told you a few weeks ago, God's stage is this earth. And he's not done with it, and he's not going to be done with it, because he's going to work out his will. That's what the prayer is. May your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Good is what is best for my neighbors, not for my good life, but good, as Jesus defines it, is what is best for my neighbors and for their prosperity and flourishing. Evil is what militates against good and replaces good. Preparation is working toward an environment where light and love and life are normal. Ideals are defined by the values that Christ taught and modeled. Hope is in the reign of Christ on earth, now through us as his agents, and then in the next age in his appearing, his personal appearing. We need each other in community as we orient our minds, as we adjust our mindset. We need each other in community, not just by social media posts, but in real conversations about life. We need each other because individuals don't have the ability to see it all. I don't have the ability to see it all. We need each other to define the purposes of God and His mission. We need each other to stay on mission. We need each other to reconcile the voice of God with the voice of this age. It's critical that we orient our hearts and minds to the way of Jesus and to the mindset of kingdom people. And it's a counterintuitive nature of everything that Jesus introduced to the people of His day, where we pray, "Your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven," where the plight of the poor and the weak and the powerless is God's concern and our concern. Let's go to the next slide, please. Let's remember, we don't overcome evil with good by listening to the news and deciding who's doing it right or wrong. That has nothing to do with overcoming evil. What we believe and whose side we're on, and whether we think they ought to outlaw abortion or let some of it happen, or whether guns ought to be controlled, or whether Trudeau ought to be ousted, or, as some people say, publicly executed. People say that. That's not the way to overcome evil with good, by knowing what we think about issues. We overcome evil with good by doing something good for real people. Never forget that. Let's imagine for a little bit this group, and this group is a good doing group. But imagine with me how some of the issues of the world and some of the things that divide people in the world would change if suddenly our group, this building and our group, all of us, our families and everybody, was just transported into a different setting. So imagine if suddenly all of us lived in a small town in Ukraine, and all of us were right around this building, and we got together and we brought our offerings and we brought our resources. What would we talk about if suddenly we were transplanted into a small town in Ukraine? What would we raise money for? What would we volunteer to do in our community? Or what if we were all suddenly transported on the southern border of the state of Arizona, right by the river, and we watched thousands of people cross that river every day? What would we raise money for? What would we volunteer to do? What would we say to one another? Or what if our church and all our homes were suddenly transplanted into Gaza? What would we raise money for? What would we do with our money? What would we volunteer to do every day? The answers to these questions can really help us with the mindset of Christ, in contrast to the mindset of preserving a nation or protecting the borders or protecting my way of life. Christ calls us to have a mindset of serving and giving and and bringing life and helping us thrive in a place where both evil and good exist. Evil and good both exist and are very apparent in Ukraine and in Russia and in Gaza and at the southern border of the U.S., where hundreds of thousands of people have crossed, and whether there's such conflict and such difference of opinion as to what ought to happen. It does no good. It does not eradicate or overcome evil for us to know what we think about that. That does nothing. What does something is when we do something good for real people. In summary, I'd like just to encourage us that we can thrive in a world such as ours when we train ourselves in the mindset of Christ, when we pursue our partnership with Him for doing good for the sake of bringing the kingdom of Christ into reality. Even in small ways, we can bring the kingdom of Christ into reality in small ways. That's way more effective, does way more in terms of good and evil than it does just to know what we think about issues that others are fighting about. And the effects of that mindset are that we ourselves also experience love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. We develop all the fruits of the Spirit as we seek to do good and to overcome evil with good. God bless you. That's what I have to share this morning.